Hello and welcome to CogX 2021, the hybrid festival. We're here in central London and you might be joining us, frankly, from around the world, wherever you're tuning in from, and frankly, whether you're watching us live or on catch up, thank you for joining us. We're asking some pretty big questions. How do we get the next 10 years right? What does the future of AI and indeed transformational technology more broadly look like? And we rely on you for your input in that, of course, and frankly, your leadership through that. This is the Global Leaders stage here, and it's my honor to introduce a whole range of great sessions through the day. I'm Ollie Barrett. I'll be your MC for the day, but specifically for this first session. And what a challenging role our very first guest has had as a leading CEO of a well-known firm, to put it mildly. I won't steal the thunder of our next brilliant interviewer, but suffice to say, this will reveal something about the future of flying, but I think more broadly, the future of how we will travel, how we will live, and how we will work. Our first interview is with the Chief Executive of British Airways, Sean Doyle, and I'm delighted to say that in the chair is the economics correspondent of Channel 4 News, Helia Ebrahimi. Welcome, Helia.
Thank you. We've had a 1 in a 300-year recession and health crisis that has seen almost 4 million people die and social restrictions never seen on this scale before. Industries have suffered, but none more so than the aviation industry, with international travel hurtling to a stop last year and government restrictions and confusing advice still holding passenger numbers back. McKinsey estimate that $382 billion has been lost in airline revenue. So, when better than 2020 to become Chief Executive of British Airways? Especially when you consider that once this crisis is over, we're going to have to face the existential threat of climate change and how to fix that. So, Sean Doyle, 2020. An interesting year to become Chief Executive.
Yes, Helia, thank you. And it's great to be here this morning to talk to such a fascinating audience. It has been a time like no other in aviation, and it was a very interesting time to take the reins. But, you know, we're a very resilient industry. We're used to dealing with crises, but it's fair to say we've never dealt with a crisis quite like this one. And, you know, it's been very, very, I think, you know, damaging to aviation. We're still trying to navigate our way out of this crisis. And of course, we've had to take some very tough decisions to pull our business through.
Is it stressful for you? Has it been kind of was it this dream job that suddenly turned into a nightmare?
Well, I suppose my background is I'm hugely passionate about aviation. I spent most of my business career working in the airline industry. And in fact, most of that time was working at British Airways. I joined in 1998 as a junior analyst. And I was very flattered to be given the opportunity to lead this great airline because I care passionately about it. You know, it's a brilliant business with some brilliant people, and we will come out the other end a better airline. So, you know, we are galvanizing around making the airline better as we come through the crisis. But, you know, it's fair to say it's tough on everybody. It's tough on me at the top, but I don't actually underestimate how challenging it's been for every single one of our employees. And I think leading, you know, such a passionate group of people through a crisis is what gets me out of bed every morning. It gives me my energy. And I think, you know, it's challenging, but we do see a pathway out of this.
Do you see that pathway? I mean, does it feel to you like we're never going to go back to the good old days? I mean, is it over for the airline industry, or is there a path to recovery?
Well, I think there is a path to recovery, and I think the pathway is driven by the fantastic success of the vaccination programs. You know, if you look back to this time last year when we didn't even have a vaccine, and if you had propelled 12 months forward and look at where we are today, I think you would have been incredibly encouraged by that type of progress. You know, today, I think nearly 80% of UK adults have had one jab. We've got over 50% are fully vaccinated. And if you look forward to mid-July, those numbers keep on getting better and better. And it's not just the UK, it's the same in the USA and the same in Europe. And, you know, although we're grappling with a delay to the opening up of broader society at the minute, you know, the vaccination programs are the way out of this. And I think they have to be the way out of it for, you know, broader opening up. but they are the way out of it for travel.
And I'm going to move over to kind of the government response and how you've coped with that and how the industry has coped with that in a second. But just more broadly on the industry itself, what is the value of the airline industry for the global economic future that we're going to see? I mean, is everyone going to be on Zoom? Is everyone going to be holidaying locally on the other end of this pandemic?
Well, I think, look, as long as we've been on this planet, we've been adventurous and we're social and we love meeting people and we love exploring new things. And I think that will carry on. I wouldn't read too much into the way we've had to adapt over the last 12 months, into the long-term prognosis for travel. And I think travel has huge benefits. Britain is an island economy. We want to be open for business. We want to be global Britain. That means actually having strong aviation networks and being able to transport goods and people all over the world. We are the cog that oils the global economy. And I think we will be a very important part of that in the future. And, if I look at the broader benefits of travel, the socioeconomic, leveling up, dealing with inequality, aviation has a huge role to play. And I think we will carry on playing that role.
Do you think customer attitudes have changed, though, since the pandemic?
What we see is when people feel it's safe to travel, like when a country goes on a green route, the demand recovers very quickly. And if I look at other markets that are ahead of the UK in opening up, like the US, we have seen a massive recovery in domestic travel. In fact, domestic travel in the United States is now at 100% of what was in 2019. We see the same in China, but also we see governments in Europe that have been more proactive in opening up travel. You see their hubs and their aviation networks rebuild very quickly. So I think the demand is there. I think it's about having a framework to allow people to travel and a framework that can allow people to travel safely.
What about in terms of business travel? Do you think the shift that we've seen to online meetings, to Zoom meetings, very much like this one, Sean, will that actually be embedded into working practices? Are we less likely to see someone jump on a plane to go from London to New York?
Well, I think we'll have to analyse that. And I think that the consensus is that business travel may recover a bit more slowly than things like holiday travel or what we call the visiting friends and relatives segment. Because people have been disconnected from their loved ones for so long, I think that is the first segment that we see come back. Because I think it's a very emotional trauma people have been through, not being able to visit their families and their relatives. But business travel is interesting because what we are seeing is fatigue with Zoom calls. I'd love to be in person there today. I'd love to be taking questions from the audience because we get so much more out of it. There's much more chemistry, much more emotion, much more of a more positive dynamic. And you do business with people, not organizations. And I think the G7 this week really highlights that. The G7...
And Sean, we just lost you at some critical moment where you were going to describe the importance of the G7. I'm gonna ask you again. What do you think the G7 meeting highlighted? That face to face is better?
Well, I think the first thing it highlighted was the need to get together physically, because of course it was a face to face meeting. And I think if our global leaders see the importance of that type of interaction, I guarantee that everybody else will follow. Business leaders, anybody who wants to go out and build relationships. But the G7, I think, is critical in building a recovery pathway, which is coordinated for sectors like aviation. So we're encouraging the UK and the US to build a framework, to open up a travel corridor, because others will follow. And we should be seizing that opportunity because both countries have made amazing progress in vaccinations. Now let's kind of reap the benefits of that in opening up the economy. And I don't think you can open up your economy unless you begin to open up travel.
And just on that point, you've talked about there being a very important link between a global economic recovery and the airline industry. Is that you just talking up your book, or is there real data behind that?
Well, no, if you look at the US, it's the second biggest trading partner for the UK. Massive foreign direct investment comes into the US. And, there's an expression back where I come from in Ireland, if you want to buy the farm, you've got to walk the land. So if we want people as part of Global Britain to come in and invest in the economy and to support the government's ambitions, they will need to come here physically. And I think aviation enables that. But if you look at tourism and hospitality as well, and the importance of those jobs to many parts of the country where there aren't alternatives, again, aviation enables, I think, that balanced economic model throughout the country. And I do think that we need to be very, very aware of the consequences of staying in the holding pattern that we're in, not just for aviation, but also for the broader economy.
Had you wanted to see more out of the G7? Had you wanted to see more finite agreement?
Yes, I think although the framework that we're evaluating is a welcome development, we can move more quickly. And I think the concern I have, being honest, is that the UK will get left behind, because I do see Europe actually moving at a quicker pace to open up. And I see the US has already opened up its domestic travel market, but we're one of the first to get a vaccination program up and running in scale. Yet I think we're lagging in terms of opening up sectors like aviation. So I would urge urgency. We need to seize the initiative pretty quickly here.
And is that frustrating, given that you are the chief executive of the national carrier, to see Britain, as you said, lagging behind?
It is frustrating, and we have been very clear that we see a way to open up travel safely and to do it quickly. So I think we kind of really have been very consistent in spelling out what that framework would look like. But the clock is ticking, and we need to get on with it.
How damaging is the government's approach of caution? I mean, yesterday you were talking about the rowing back from the grand opening day of 21st of June. Are you sympathetic with why the government is having to be extra cautious? Or does it make you tear your hair out as a business leader?
Well, look, I think the one thing we've always been saying is about opening up travel safely. And in aviation, we've dealt with crises down through the years where we've had to respond and deal with risk, and we manage risk every day. So risk is in our genes, it's in our DNA. So we're not advocating, the complete opening up of travel in an uncontrolled way. But what we do think is there are countries out there which have very low risk, low infection levels, high rates of vaccination, and we should be opening up aviation between those countries. And we should be acknowledging that vaccinated travelers have an inherently lower risk when they travel than those who don't. And with us approaching the thresholds of vaccinations that we see, it's crazy not to try and reap that dividend.
What are your discussions with government like? What is the resistance on their point? Do you think they're worried about the headlines it might create? Look at what's happened with the Indian variant and accusations that they move too slowly. How do you feel the dialogue with government has gone?
Yeah, well, look, I think the Indian situation is not really relevant to kind of the framework we're pushing for. We're pushing for the opening up of low-risk countries. So if we look at the green list today, we have a handful of countries on there. If we look at the criteria that we were led to believe would lead to countries being on the green list, there should be at least 12 countries in there, including the US. So this is about opening up safe corridors of travel, as we said earlier. And I think, we're frustrated by the lack of progress here, but we keep on encouraging the government to do so. Look, we understand the broader public health concerns, and we have been very responsible, I think, in our inputs so far. But what is, I think, a problem now is that the UK looks like it's beginning to get left behind compared to other countries. And I think that will have economic consequences as well as consequences for the aviation industry and the jobs that depend on it.
And Sean, what are the main issues with the traffic light system? Has it worked?
Well, I think the first thing is we don't have transparency about when countries are in or out. And if we look at the decision around Portugal, that was very frustrating because there was no indication that Portugal would be moved to amber. And I think we didn't get visibility of the data that moves a country in and out of amber or green.
And how do you plan for that? As the chief executive of an airline, how flexible can you be? How can you plan your routes? How can you plan staffing? How has that been to manage?
Well, I think that's exactly the problem here, because you cannot start aviation networks up overnight. You need to get your crews lined up. You need to get your planes in the right place. You need to get all of your flying programs published. And also, we need to understand that as customers here who are suffering from the uncertainty. So, I felt that people who had traveled out to Portugal and then had this news about the change to amber, imposed upon them, I thought that was unfair. And, it doesn't give customers the right framework to plan against, and it doesn't give airlines the right framework to plan against. And I think we can do better, and we can do better and also be safe. And that's the opportunity that we need to seize here.
And how do you keep morale up with your colleagues, with your staff, given the situation? When there are pathways that you're all working towards, and that's reversed or changed or stifled in some way, how do you keep morale up within your team?
Yeah, well, I think it's you'd be lying to say that keeping morale up hasn't been difficult considering the volatility and the uncertainty. And of course, we had to react very quickly to make some big changes to our business to make sure that we would come through the crisis. And, that has been tough on people in British Airways, but also tough on the people in the broader aviation industry. But I think there's a couple of rules that I follow. One is you've got to be honest. I think you can't sugarcoat the scale of what you're dealing with. You've got to be transparent. But at the same time, I think you've got to also articulate what the business will be like when you come out the other end. And the fact that we have an opportunity through the crisis to accelerate innovation, to make the business more resilient, and to make sure that British Airways will be a better airline when we get back up to a full scale of operation.
So what does success look like after the pandemic for Sean Doyle?
Well, I think success looks like one is I think that, British Airways really does kind of fulfill its role at the heart of the economic model of Britain. We connect Britain with the world and the world with Britain, and we want to build our networks back up quickly so that we can carry on serving more places directly out of our hub than any other place in Europe, because we had a leadership position in aviation.
Has that gone? Has that disappeared, do you think?
Well, I think, the government needs to appreciate that the longer we are left with the policies that are stagnating us, the more jeopardy that comes into the UK aviation sector. And it's not just us, but, we have had the third biggest aviation network in the world in the UK. We had great homegrown carriers, and consumers in the UK had more direct services to locations anywhere in Europe or the world than any other European city. And we can't take that for granted. But we want to get those networks up and running and get them back to the scale that we're used to very quickly. But secondly, we want to drive innovation, at a pace into our business model. And thirdly, I think it's obvious that sustainability is going to be a defining feature of everything we do in our lives, including aviation. So finding the narrative and the pathway to net zero and articulating that with confidence is going to be a fundamental KPI for everybody in the industry, as well as in British Airways.
Should the government have done more? The Chancellor would turn around and say, we've spent £372 billion propping up the UK economy, supporting businesses. For airlines, for aviation, should the government have done? Did you hear that?
Yeah, you broke up there. Could you repeat that question?
What I'm curious about is, from your perspective, the government's line is that they have unleashed, record-breaking fiscal support. They have helped business people through furlough, through loans, through grants. But does it feel, from an aviation perspective, like more should have been done?
Well, look, we availed of the furlough, and we were very grateful for the support that the government gave us. But I think airlines all over the world have received various degrees of support. And if I look at the US industry, I think the CARES Act was actually far more significant in the amount of grant aid it gave aviation. And I think the US carriers are also in the fortunate position of rebuilding their networks and generating revenue more quickly than, say, the UK sector is in. So I think the best thing the government can do is to give us a safe framework where we can rebuild travel. And we need to get on with that. That is the best way, is to get the industry to self-help. But in the event that it doesn't kind of enable that, I think, yes, the government should be doing more to support the sector.
Do you think they value the airline sector as much as they should? Is it analogous, perhaps, with after the financial crisis, the way the US government supported American banks, saw them through a period of growth compared to their European rivals? Do you worry about that?
Yeah, well, I haven't really, drawn that comparison yet, because I think the situation in the banking sector was very, very different. And you've got to remember that this crisis, came and hit the aviation industry. It wasn't something that was a consequence of actions within the industry. We're a victim of it. And we had very well capitalized and very well run airlines before the crisis. And I think, if we want to, as an island nation, be trading again, a strong aviation network is fundamental to it. And I think we would impress that upon policymakers and the government. And, to make sure that we can get back on our operating to the scale that we want as quickly as we can is our main ask.
And I've heard you talk about the mindset around the pandemic before, and I just wanted to explore that a little bit. do we need to accept that we have to live with COVID? Do we need to give up this idea that we're going to eliminate COVID? Is it about mitigation of risk? Is it is the pathway forward actually about managing the situation rather than trying to eliminate it?
Yes, and I think the Prime Minister more or less said as much in his address last night, and I think everybody has been commenting along those lines, and I think that's, you know, imminently sensible. I think it's always been the narrative around how we're going to have to deal with COVID. You know, our vaccination programs are about risk management. They're about reducing hospitalizations and fatalities, but nobody ever had the expectation that we would eliminate COVID. And I think we're going to have to live alongside this virus for quite a long time to come. But we can do that. You know, we can mitigate the risks. We have vaccinations, we have testing. And I think, again, aviation can live alongside the pandemic very effectively. And I think that's what we're asking for, is aviation, like other parts of the economy, to get a fair crack of the whip. But I agree, it's got to be founded on a philosophy of coexistence and risk management rather than elimination.
And my final question on this subject, you know, you're an international company, you see a lot of governments in action. Which governments have got it right?
But look, I'm kind of, we're still coming out the other end of this, but I do see, you know, over the last few weeks, you know, if I look at governments around Europe, for instance, they're looking at the digital green certificate for travel. They're looking at the lower risk of vaccinated travelers. You know, having come from a position where they were behind the UK, they now appear to be stealing a march. But, you know, our opportunity isn't lost yet. I think we can also look at similar protocols for enabling travel and recover ground. And I do think we should look at the US. You know, the US opened up its economy about 10 weeks ago. It fully opened up travel. It carried on vaccinating, and infections have continued to fall. So I think, you know, the link between a fully functioning travel industry and, you know, infections is very much broken when you look at what's happened in the US. And we should be brave enough to look outside of our borders and learn from countries that are a little bit ahead of us.
Let's turn, Sean, to the climate crisis and talk about the road to decarbonisation, because lots of campaigners would ask, can an industry like yours, which has been part of the problem, really be part of the solution?
Well, yes, I think the first thing I would say is nobody in aviation is in any doubt that we need to get to a carbon net zero position. And I'm very proud of our track record in committing to this and trying to set leadership in the space. British Airways was the first airline to, you know, trade in carbon credits back in 2002. Our group IAG was the first airline to commit to carbon net zero by 2050. And only a couple of weeks ago, we committed to power 10% of all of our airlines via sustainable aviation fuel by 2030. And the industry itself was the first industry to commit to a form of self-regulation through the emissions trading framework of CORSIA. So I don't think the industry is ignorant or ignoring the problem. In fact, if anything, I think it's seizing the initiative with energy. But it will take 30 years for us to get there. You know,
is that fast enough, Sean? Is that fast enough? I mean, some people would say to you, level with people. If you want to halt the climate crisis, you can't travel halfway around the world for a week's holiday. You can't jump on a plane for a business trip. It's just not compatible. Do you disagree with that?
I would disagree, because I think we are going to have parts of the economy that have a slower path to net zero than others. And I think, you know, the reality is that aviation, by the time you get to 2050, will you have alternative forms of propulsion which are carbon zero, like hydrogen? I think you will. And I think they will form a significant part of the solution. But it's multidimensional. You know, we are investing in new, more fuel-efficient aircraft. We retired 31 747s over the course of last year. And the aircraft that are coming in to replace them are about 45% more efficient. We're also investing in sustainable aviation fuel. We have a supply agreement with LanzaJet, but we're also developing a plant in Lincolnshire to be the first SAF plant in the UK. And, you know, that will form part of the solution. We do see hydrogen aircraft coming on stream, and we've invested in a startup called Zero Avia.
Is that the most exciting technology that you're seeing?
And I think the sort of energy is building around hydrogen-powered aircraft significantly over the last 2 years. You know, Airbus seem to think that that is part of the solution we will need, as do other innovators. And of course, that is carbon zero propulsion. But that will take time. And I think, you know, there will be other parts of our economy, like food production, like construction, which again will need, I think, slower pathways to net zero. But we're guided by the science, and our plan is guided by the UN sustainability goals of maintaining, of getting to net zero by 2050. And I think that's why, you know, we're not looking for headlines here. We're looking for a very credible and realistic pathway to get the industry to net zero. But it is a 30-year journey that we're on.
And you talked about hydrogen and a couple of the other initiatives in fuel efficiency. There's been a lot of talk about electric planes. Do you put much faith in that? Would there ever be practical to have an electric plane of a significant size?
Yeah, well, I think you could see electric planes, but we do see hybrid hydrogen and electric really impacting shorter journeys and smaller gauge aircraft in the near term. So I think by the start of the 2030s, you will see journeys of maybe up to 90 minutes. An aircraft with a capacity of up to 100 seats will have those alternative forms of propulsion and power. I think when you look at mid and long haul aircraft, it will take longer. But, you know, the pace
How much longer? How much longer?
Well, I think we've yet to see sort of the technology pathway emerge. But I think you're looking at maybe 10 years beyond 2030 before you see a plane flying to Singapore powered by, you know, exclusively by those type of solutions. But of course, you do have opportunities to make existing propulsion more efficient.
Yes.
You know, there's a lot of technology and data that we can use. There's a lot of work we do in terms of flight planning and flight paths. And there's a lot of weight and waste that we are always eliminating from the journey. So I think, you know, the industry will become a lot more efficient. But some forms of travel will probably get there quicker than others.
And
but
is that...
Sorry,
Sean, is that, I'm just wondering your approach, your strategy. Do you think it's more practical, more achievable to have these incremental goals rather than the blue sky thinking we're all going to be jumping on electric planes in a couple of years?
Well, I don't think they're necessarily incompatible. I think what we're saying is, based on the kind of innovation pathway out there we see today, this is how we would get to carbon net zero by 2050. I think, you know, if innovation, you know, increases and new solutions come along, all the better. But I think we've got to invest in both. There are near-term opportunities that will really improve the sustainability of the industry. And then there is medium-term
Sean,
to aviation, which is
Sean,
zero carbon.
We just lost you ever so slightly at the tail end of that. I think you were saying there was short term and medium term. But I wonder if I can ask you about boom and the return of supersonic travel. Is that plausible in a carbon constrained world?
Yeah, we have a lot of experience with supersonic travel because we were one of only 2 airlines in the world to have that solution in our fleet in the form of Concorde. So we know a lot about supersonic travel. I think we would assess these opportunities probably on 2 merits. One is their economic viability. And 2, obviously, what comes into that assessment is the sustainability of the business model. So I think at the minute we would have more questions to ask than answers on whether this is viable or not. You know, there's many aspects of it are very attractive in terms of the convenience and the sort of groundbreaking nature of it. But I think, you know, whether it's scalable and, you know, whether it meets the thresholds of viability and sustainability, I think, you know, we would still be looking to kind of evaluate, I think, along those lines.
And of the suite of technologies and innovations that you're coming across at the moment, what is the most exciting for you?
Well, I think, you know, when we look at the energy around hydrogen technology, that appears to be quite exciting. And we've invested in a company called ZeroAvia, which has already actually powered some propeller flights using hydrogen-based technology. So I think, you know, that is one of the pathways which I think is very exciting, and that is truly a game changer. But also, I think, you know, even something which is there in front of us is sustainable aviation fuel. And what we can do is we can really accelerate the development of sustainable aviation fuel. And there's a number of benefits of doing that. One, I think it forms a very, very significant part of the answer for aviation. But in terms of, you know, creating jobs in parts of the UK that need jobs in remoter locations, you know, we can build up to 14 sustainable aviation fuel plants in the UK. We can repurpose refineries, and we can also repurpose waste that would not be used otherwise into a much more sustainable solution for aviation. And that is very exciting. And I think it's an opportunity that we can seize right now if we work properly with policymakers.
And I'm going to ask you a few more questions on this, but I just wanted to invite people at home who are tuned in. If they had any questions for Sean, just put in your questions into the online form and I'll have a look and put them to him. Same for the audience. If you have any questions, do put your hands up. I'll come to you in a few minutes. Just finally on technology and the road to carbonizations, I wonder if you can ever imagine a BA Airship. Is that something that's possible?
Well, look, we're always kind of probing the boundaries of our imagination. It's not a project we have in scope at the minute, but you know, maybe you've prompted a question for my my innovation team to go and consider. But you know, maybe innovation is about coming full circle rather than doing something completely different. Who knows?
And I want to reflect on the pathway forward. You said it's plausible for the industry to get to net zero by 2050, and it's all about this incremental steps and a whole suite of solutions. What will the airline industry look like in 2050?
Well, I think you know, the first thing I would say is that I do think that travel serves society, you know, a number of benefits. It's hugely important. You know, if you look at sort of the social benefits of connecting the world and opening up horizons, opening up economies, learning about cultures and learning about our differences. And I think we've become a better global society as a result of what we do in terms of what travel enables. But also if I look at tourism and the benefits that has in terms of, you know, economic development and developing, you know, socially disadvantaged parts of the world, again, travel plays a huge role in leveling up. And I do think that it's fundamental to our human nature that we want to explore and we want to experience. I don't see that changing. In fact, I see the industry growing and I see the demand for travel growing. But I think we do need to make sure that travel is sustainable. You know, people do not have issues with travel. I think we have issues with the carbon footprint it leaves. And, you know, as we address that, I think the industry has a very bright future.
And on biofuels, because there's been lots of talk about biofuels and powering planes, could that be part of the solution, or are there many more questions about how environmentally friendly, given the way biofuels are grown?
Well, we sustainable aviation fuel is a form of biofuel, but it's sourced from municipal waste, and it can also be generated from the repurpose of gas emissions that you know, can be used to actually generate sustainable aviation fuel. So our kind of commitment is to make sure that we are sourcing alternative aviation fuels which have lower carbon life cycle footprints, but not at the expense of agricultural land or land use.
Is that a risk? Do you think that's a risk? Unintended consequences?
I don't think so, because I think when we look at both the technology and the pathway for sustainable aviation fuel, it does take that into account. And we do see SAF opportunities which don't erode upon land use and aren't using agricultural produce, you know, as being very significant. But, you know, that issue is firmly in our heads and is very much considered when we embark on our investments and into our supplies.
And can you, how much of your day or how much of your time, it's very difficult because as you've become chief executive in a time of firefighting, but how much of your ideal day would be spent thinking about future strategy, about these 10-year plus plans?
But I think what you do in a crisis is you've got to manage the near term, and you know, you've got to be very dynamic and decisive in dealing with that. But at the same time, I think you have opportunities to be transformative in the middle of a crisis. And we've done some amazing things over the course of the pandemic, particularly using digital apps to really, you know, meet customer needs far more quickly than we would have done pre-pandemic. So, you know, we've rolled out verification apps to allow you to upload your documentation and meet the needs to cross a border before you get to the airport. And we're able to verify that both on our own app, ba.com, but also using partners. When you walk into an airport today, you know, you can actually select your check-in time using our Qmatic app. When you walk into a lounge, you can sit down and pre-order your catering so that you don't have to walk up to a counter. We can hand deliver it. So, you know, we're making the customer experience better, but we're also learning a lot more about what people want and how they want to experience the journey. And I think data, innovation and technology are very much now at the center of how we do that. And I think we're coming out of the pandemic with a lot of learnings, a lot of pace at which we can innovate.
And just reflecting on that, we're coming out of the pandemic. In this period, What has been the most challenging issue for you? What has been the toughest moment for you?
I think, look, you mentioned it earlier, and the things which airlines need and the industry needs is a framework against which to plan, because we can't start up aviation networks overnight. We've a lot of people waiting in the wings who want to come back to do what they love, which is to fly people all over the world and do it safely. But we do need to have a roadmap out of this for aviation. And at the minute, we're still stuck in a holding pattern. So what's frustrating is not really knowing, when we can start rebuilding the networks. And I think, that rests outside of our hands at the minute. It's about policy and it's with government. So I think it's the lack of certainty against which to plan is one of the frustrating things, not just for me, but I think for anybody in the UK aviation industry at the minute.
And what's the risk of that? Could you see a situation that's so corrosive, so damaging that the aviation, as you said, the aviation industry in the UK would get left behind, that you can't recover? Is that a risk?
Well, of course it's a risk, and I think I've articulated that, and everybody else has been, I think, very consistent in saying it. But I would rather focus on the opportunity, and the opportunity is with the rate of vaccinations we have, with the testing capability we have, with the technology we have. We should be in much better shape this summer than we were last summer with travel. And I think it's a missed opportunity that we're not. And I think we have an opportunity to correct that and correct it quickly.
So the other side of that question, though it seems hard that the last 8 months would have provided you with this, but what has been the highlight for you?
I think the highlight has been the resilience of the people in British Airways in responding to every challenge that's been thrown our way. We've been dynamic, we've been flexible, and we've been working hard to look after our customers in what's been incredibly volatile and challenging times. But we've learned an awful lot about leadership and about managing a crisis, and I think that will be a very, very beneficial attribute when we begin to rebuild the airline. And I think we've developed a lot of strong leaders throughout the business, and I really look forward to kind of building the business back with those people, as opposed to just kind of managing a day-to-day crisis.
I think that's wonderful. I want to open it up to the floor if there are any questions over here. Gentlemen, if you just tell us your name and where you're from, and I'll repeat the question. Okay, I'm going to try and reword your brilliant question. This is all about congestion. The skies are empty at the moment, but what's the BA plan to deal with increased congestion, air taxis, drones, a whole load more things in the sky? I think that's the general thing. How is BA going to deal with that?
Well, I think what we are pushing for, obviously, is airspace reform, because I think there's many ways in which we can make the utilization of airspace more efficient. And I think we are, still dealing with probably airspace regimes and protocols which are 40, 50 years old. And I think that can make the skies more efficient. It can also reduce the carbon footprint of airspace management. And secondly, I think we've got similar opportunities across Europe. We have a very fragmented process of managing airspace. We have multiple, what we call ANSPs. If you compare that to, say, the US, where they have very much a smaller, more centralized approach, I think there are big opportunities, again, to make flight paths more efficient. And by making them more efficient, I think we reduce the carbon footprint of aviation. So I think we do need airspace reform. There is a government program up and running, which we're part of. And I think you're right, we are pushing, as part of both the sustainability agenda, but also as part of, the broader, airspace modernization agenda to get on with that project.
What are the timelines for that?
Well, I think it's still very much in a consultation phase, even in the next years, that we put the meat and the bones of a reform program for airspace.
Brilliant. Are there any other questions in the room? So Sean, I think the question from the floor is that the migratory patterns seem to amplify the pandemic and the spread of the pandemic. Do you worry about travel coming back full throttle in years going forward, and whether that leaves us vulnerable to further pandemics or further health risks?
Well, I think, what you mentioned earlier about having to coexist alongside the virus is going to be very important. And I think we have strategies to coexist alongside the virus. One, I think, we've got much better monitoring of situations. And two, we got much better testing capability. Three, we've got vaccines, which you got to remember, we're in the first year of the vaccination program. And I think already we're hearing about great innovations on things like booster shots and ways to kind of evolve the vaccines to deal with all comers in terms of variants. So I think you've got to look at those type of innovations and have confidence in our ability to deal with future versions of this, and to have a future where travel alongside other forms of economic activity coexists. And I firmly believe that, actually. I do think that, although, news like last night is a setback, it's a temporary setback, because I keep on going back to the fact that, we have rolled out 5 different vaccines with very high efficacy, 12 months after the start of this pandemic. And that should give us huge confidence about our ability to live with this and to risk manage it.
And a question in the back. So I think the question there, Sean, is about the customer experience. Obviously, there's been huge amounts of changes and cancellations and delays, and putting flights back and giving vouchers and tier rewards and all of that. Do you feel confident that that customers will emerge from this pandemic feeling that they've had all of their points, their rewards, their flights benefited, all of the customer experience will be whole?
Yes, look, we're working very hard to try and manage what's been an unprecedented crisis. There were times last year where we were flying only 5% of our program, so we had to enact, very sweeping changes to our flying program quickly. But, we've been absolutely focused on how we can look after our customers throughout the pandemic. We have extended tier points. We have offered unprecedented flexibility in terms of conditions. But, I am encouraged by, the demand that we see when markets open up. Markets which aren't the UK, like the US and even China, where domestic travel is very high and people are back traveling. But also, when countries like Portugal were added to the green list, we did see a surge of people interested in booking. And that gives me confidence that, when people are let travel safely, that our customers are ready and waiting. And, we're there to look after them as best as we can. And the experience will be a little bit different, but we'll deliver it with the standards and with the commitment to excellence that people expect from British Airways.
Thank you very much, Sean Doyle. A promise to treat your customers in the standards of excellence. And I really appreciated your optimistic view about how we get out of the pandemic. Thank you so much for talking to us about what is an incredibly difficult situation. And as I said at the beginning, none more so than for the aviation industry. Sean Doyle.
Thank you, Helia. Thank you, everybody.